Hey, everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're going deep on a topic one of you sent in, and I think it's something that's really, really relevant, especially as future mental health student nurses. We're going to be talking about consent and capacity. And you sent in some fascinating stuff. There are legal documents in there, some pretty thought-provoking case studies, even a nursing workbook. So clearly you're aiming for a very comprehensive understanding of all this, and that's what we're here for. And to help us navigate all this, and sometimes it can feel like we're navigating a bit of a maze, I've brought along our expert who has a really fantastic way of taking even the trickiest legal jargon and turning it into something that is understandable and relatable.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think this is such a fascinating topic, and it is essential for ethical practice. As a mental health nurse.
Okay, so let's kick things off. I think a good place to start is with this nursing workbook that you sent in. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how they emphasize those core elements of what makes consent valid.
hmm
Informed voluntaries and given by someone with capacity. So on the surface, it seems simple, but I imagine in practice it gets a lot more complicated.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one of those things that, in theory, sounds nice and straightforward, but then you get to the real world, and especially in mental health settings, it can get really complex. Imagine you're working with a patient who's experiencing paranoia. Even if they verbally agree to treatment, is it truly voluntary if they're being driven by fear or distorted perceptions? So that's where capacity really comes into play.
Yeah, you brought up capacity, and this workbook had this brilliant analogy. I don't know if you remember it. They compared capacity to a four-legged stool, and each leg represents a key element: understanding appreciation, reasoning, and communication. And if any of those legs are wobbly, capacity is in question. I really love that image. But as a student nurse, how do you actually assess those legs in a real person?
That's a great question, and it's something even seasoned nurses sometimes grapple with, because it's not always a black and white assessment. It involves really careful observation and sensitive questioning. So let's take that understanding leg, for example. You might ask a patient about their diagnosis in a way that goes beyond just repeating facts. You could say something like, "Can you tell me in your own words what you understand about why you're here at the hospital?" Yeah, and their response will give you some insight into their level of comprehension.
That makes so much sense. It's not just can they repeat back the terminology, but do they actually grasp it in a meaningful way? And what about the other legs of the school? What are some signs to say the appreciation leg might be a bit shaky?
Yeah, so appreciation goes beyond just understanding the facts. It's about grasping the potential consequences of a decision. So, for instance, a patient might understand they need surgery, but do they appreciate what recovery will entail? Can they foresee the challenges? And if their appreciation seems limited, that could be a signal that capacity is compromised.
Okay, so we've got this framework now for thinking about capacity, but then you sent in these real life case studies, and they really bring home, I think, how complex this can be. So let's talk about Hannah Jones, the 13-year-old who refused a heart transplant. This one really struck me. She's so young, facing such a huge decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hannah's case is just ethically challenging on so many levels. It forces us to confront these difficult questions about autonomy and the evolving capacity of minors. And her story really highlights something called Gillick competence. Have you heard of that before?
I have you.
Okay, so this legal principle recognizes that minors can make their own healthcare choices if they have sufficient understanding and intelligence to fully appreciate what's
Right.
involved. So it's not about reaching a specific age, but rather having the maturity to weigh the risks and benefits and make a truly informed choice.
So let's say as a mental health student nurse, I'm in a situation similar to Hannah's case. What would be some red flags that would make me think, hold on, we need to really consider this young person's competence to make this decision?
Yeah, that's the kind of critical thinking that will serve you well in practice. Some red flags might be if their understanding seems very superficial, if they can't articulate the potential consequences of their choice, or if they're overly influenced by external pressures, that could be from family or even medical staff. So it's about ensuring their decision is truly their own, not coerced or based on a fleeting emotion.
Hannah's case just highlights how nuanced this whole consent and capacity issue can be, especially when we're talking about young people. But what happens when we're dealing with someone who clearly doesn't have that capacity to even express their wishes? And this makes me think of patient A. This was the individual with learning disabilities who was given a DNAR order without properly being consulted.
Yeah, patient A's story is a really sad example of what can go wrong when those core principles of consent and capacity are overlooked. And in this case, it seems like there was a presumption of incapacity. based solely on the patient's learning disabilities. And that can be a dangerous path to tread because each individual's capacity needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and the report really emphasized that this GP jumped to conclusions about patient A's capacity without even trying to involve their support team. And it feels like that was a real missed opportunity to truly understand this patient's perspective and their wishes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this case really reinforces the importance of communication and involving a patient's support network. And it's a reminder that clear and compassionate communication is paramount, especially when working with individuals who might have communication challenges. We need to explore all possible avenues to understand their wishes and make sure their voice is heard, even if it's not through those traditional means.
These cases have really illuminated, I think, the human side of these legal concepts. They make it clear that consent capacity aren't just these abstract ideas, they have a real impact on people's lives. Now, let's shift gears a bit and delve into the more legal side of things, and focusing specifically on the documents that you submitted from Jersey. And this is where it can feel a bit overwhelming, so I'm really glad we have you here to guide us through it.
Yeah, happy to help decode the legalese. But I think it is important to remember that these legal frameworks are there to protect vulnerable individuals and ensure their rights are upheld, even when they might not be able to advocate for themselves.
Okay, so let's start with this thing called an ADR. Advanced Decision to Refuse Treatment, or ADRT, as it's often shortened to. It sounds pretty self-explanatory. But what are the finer points that mental health student nurses really need to grasp?
So, an ADRT is a powerful tool that allows individuals to express their wishes about future medical treatment in case they lose capacity to make those decisions later on. So, essentially, it's like having a voice even when you might not be able to speak for yourself.
That makes a lot of sense. But I imagine there must be quite strict rules surrounding these ADRTs to make sure they're actually valid and legally binding. What are some of the things that nurses need to be extra careful about?
You're right, there are specific requirements for an ADRT to hold legal weight. So, for instance, the person creating the ADRT has to have capacity when they make it, they need to clearly outline the treatments they're refusing, and the document needs to be properly witnessed and signed. So, it's not something to be taken lightly, as it can have significant consequences for a patient's care.
Okay, so as a mental health student nurse, if I encounter a patient with an ADRT,
hmm
what are the key steps I need to take to make sure I'm acting ethically and legally?
First and foremost, always verify the document's validity. Is it signed and witnessed correctly? Does it clearly state the patient's wishes? And then you need to carefully assess the patient's current capacity. Remember, an ADRT only comes into play when someone has lost capacity. If the patient currently has capacity and their wishes differ from what's stated in the ADRT, their current wishes take
It's
precedence.
like a double check system. Verify the document, verify the patient's current state.
That makes a lot of sense. Now let's move on to another concept you highlighted, significant restriction on liberty, or SRAL. I mean, even the term itself sounds a bit intimidating.
Sure.
So when does this come into play, and what should mental health student nurses know about it? Yeah, SRAL can seem like a daunting topic,
Yeah.
but it's crucial to understand because it touches upon some of the most sensitive aspects of mental health care. It comes into play when someone lacks capacity to consent to the arrangements for their care and treatment, and less restrictive options have been exhausted. So essentially, it's about striking a balance between protecting a person's rights and ensuring their safety and well-being, which can be a very delicate balancing act.
So we're talking about situations where someone might need to be in a hospital or care facility, even their own home, but with certain restrictions in place.
Exactly.
Can you give us a concrete example to help us understand what kinds of restrictions we're talking about?
Sure. Imagine a patient who, because of their mental health condition, poses a risk to themselves if they leave the ward unsupervised. So an SROL might involve restricting their freedom to leave the ward without staff accompaniment. It could also involve things like locked doors, close supervision, or limitations on certain activities.
This brings up a question for me. If an SRAIL is being considered a leader, what are the steps involved to ensure the patient's rights are protected and that this restriction is truly justified? It sounds like a decision that shouldn't be taken lightly.
You're absolutely right. It's a process that requires very careful consideration and adherence to legal safeguards. So it usually begins with an urgent authorization, kind of like an emergency measure to ensure immediate safety. Then a capacity and liberty assessor, or CLA, steps in to conduct a thorough assessment. So they gather information from various sources, including the individual themselves, their family healthcare professionals. They observe the person's behavior and evaluate their understanding and their ability to make decisions about their care.
So it sounds like the CLA plays a pretty crucial role in this process. What happens after they complete their assessment? Who ultimately makes the decision about whether to implement the SRL?
So the CLA's role is pivotal. They compile their findings into a detailed report that goes to the minister, who then holds the ultimate authority to authorize the SRO. So the CLA's assessment is a key piece of evidence that informs the minister's decision. And this independent layer of oversight is designed to ensure that restricting someone's liberty is only done when absolutely necessary and with proper justification.
That makes me feel a bit better, knowing that there are those checks and balances in place. But what about the individual at the center of all this? Do they have any say in the matter, even if they lack capacity?
That's where the role of the Independent Capacity Advocate, or ICA, becomes incredibly important. So they are there to represent the person's interests, especially if they don't have family or friends who can advocate for them. They can challenge the SRL, they can ensure the person's voice is heard, and they can help navigate the complexities of the legal process.
So even in those situations where someone might not be able to fully express their wishes, there are mechanisms in place to ensure they are not simply being silenced or overlooked. That's reassuring to know.
Yeah, it's a fundamental principle of human rights and ethical care. Even when someone lacks capacity, their dignity and autonomy must be respected. And these legal frameworks, while complex, are ultimately designed to uphold those values.
All these layers of legal protection and advocacy just seem so crucial, especially in a field as sensitive as mental health.
Hmm.
But it makes me think, how does this all tie into the capacity and self-determination law? How does this law guide our actions as future nurses? And how does it ensure that we're truly putting the person at the heart of every decision?
That's a great question, and one that takes us to the heart of ethical practice. So the capacity and self-determination law is built on 5 key principles. Assumption of capacity, taking all practical steps, respecting unwise decisions, acting in the person's best interests, and choosing the least restrictive option. So it's a framework for navigating those tricky situations where someone might lack capacity, while still upholding their individual rights and dignity.
Okay, let's unpack those principles one by one. You mentioned assumption of capacity. What does that mean in practice? I imagine there are a lot of assumptions made about people with mental health conditions.
Yeah, you're right. Assumptions can be dangerous in any area of healthcare, especially mental health. So the principle of assumption of capacity means we start by presuming that every individual has the capacity to make decisions about their own care. It's about shifting away from that deficit-based model and recognizing that even when someone has a mental health diagnosis, they may still be perfectly capable of understanding and making choices about their treatment.
So it's about avoiding those knee-jerk reactions like, oh, they have schizophrenia, so they must lack capacity.
Yeah.
It's about approaching each person with a fresh perspective and genuinely assessing their individual abilities.
Exactly.
And that leads us to the second principle, taking all practicable steps. So this means we don't just give up if someone's initial communication seems unclear, or if they struggle to understand complex medical terminology.
Right. It's about being creative, using visual aids involving family members or advocates, and finding ways to support the person in making their own decisions.
It's like going that extra mile to meet them where they are, rather than expecting them to conform to our preconceived notions of how a patient should communicate.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that capacity isn't always static. It can fluctuate depending on various factors,
Yeah.
including, their mental state, their environment, their support system. So it's a dynamic process that demands flexibility and responsiveness from us as nurses.
This is all so insightful, and I can see how these principles can guide us towards more ethical and compassionate care. But I have to admit, the idea of respecting unwise decisions is one that really makes me pause. What if a patient is making a choice that seems detrimental to their well-being? How do we reconcile that with our duty of care?
Yeah, that's the heart of the ethical dilemma, isn't it? It's a question I think every healthcare professional grapples with at some point in their career. And the principle of respecting unwise decisions reminds us that autonomy isn't just about agreeing with someone's choices. It's about respecting their right to make those choices, even if we personally disagree with them.
So even if we believe a patient is making a mistake, as long as they have capacity, we need to respect their decision. That must be so difficult in some cases, especially when you're dealing with life or death situations.
Yeah, it can be one of the toughest challenges in healthcare. However, the capacity and self-determination law emphasizes that we can't simply impose our own values or judgments on our patients. It's about guiding them, supporting them, providing them with information, exploring all options, but ultimately respecting their right to self-determination.
That makes me think back to Hannah Jones's case. Even though the medical team likely believed that the heart transplant was in her best interests, they ultimately respected her decision to refuse it. It's a powerful example of upholding autonomy, even when it leads to a difficult outcome.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final two principles: acting in the person's best interests and choosing the least restrictive option. And these principles really come into play when someone truly lacks capacity to make a specific decision. So in those cases, our responsibility shifts to making decisions that we believe are in their best interests, but always aiming for the option that restricts their freedom the least.
This all ties together so seamlessly. It's a framework for ethical decision-making that puts the person at the center regardless of their capacity. I'm already starting to see how this will inform my actions as a future mental health nurse.
Yeah, it's a journey, and these principles will serve as a compass, I think, throughout your career.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored those core elements of consent and capacity, delved into those real-world cases that highlight the complexity, and even started to unravel the intricacies of Jersey's legal frameworks. I'm already feeling more confident in my understanding, but I'm really eager to dive deeper into the practical application of all this knowledge.
Yeah, that's exactly where we're headed next. So, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore specific scenarios you might encounter as a mental health student nurse, and we'll discuss how these principles translate into real world action. So, stay tuned. It's fascinating, isn't it, how a simple word like capacity can hold so much weight in a healthcare setting. It's not just a legal concept, it's a doorway to understanding a person's autonomy and their ability to participate in their own care.
It really is, and I think the way you broke down those 5 principles from the capacity and self-determination law has made it much clearer how we as future nurses can put those principles into action. But I'm curious, those principles provide a great framework, but how do they actually play out in the real world, especially in the fast-paced, sometimes chaotic environment of mental health care?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one thing to understand the theory, but it's another to apply it when you're facing a patient in crisis, a family in distress, and a whole team of healthcare professionals trying to navigate this complex ethical and legal terrain.
Exactly. So let's bridge that gap between theory and practice. Let's say I'm on my clinical placement and I encounter a patient who's experiencing a psychotic episode. They're agitated, they're delusional, and they're refusing medication. How do I, as a student nurse, even begin to assess their capacity in that kind of situation?
That's a scenario that many mental health nurses, even experienced ones, find challenging. First, remember those core principles. Start by assuming capacity. Don't automatically jump to the conclusion that because they're experiencing psychosis, they can't make decisions for themselves.
Okay, so approach them with that presumption of capacity. But how do I actually assess it in a practical way, especially when they might be disoriented or distrustful?
It requires a combination of keen observation, sensitive communication, and a willingness to adapt your approach. You might start by simply observing their behavior. Are they able to follow basic instructions? Can they engage in a coherent conversation, even if the content of their thoughts is distorted?
That makes sense. It's about looking for clues in their actions and their words, even if those words aren't always reflecting reality.
Yeah.
But what if their behavior is erratic or unpredictable? Does that automatically mean they lack capacity?
Not necessarily. Remember, capacity can fluctuate. It's not a static state. Someone might be capable of making a decision about their medication in the morning, but then as their symptoms worsen in the afternoon, they might lose that capacity. It's a fluid process that requires ongoing assessment.
So as a student nurse, I need to be constantly observing, reassessing, and adjusting my approach based on the patient's evolving state. It sounds like there's no room for complacency or making assumptions based on a single interaction.
Precisely. And communication is key. Even if a patient is experiencing psychosis, try to engage them in a respectful dialogue. Explain things in simple, clear language, avoiding jargon or complex medical terminology. Ask open-ended questions to gauge their understanding, like, can you help me understand what's making you hesitant to take the medication?
That's really helpful advice. It reminds me of something the nursing workbook mentioned about using a variety of communication methods, like visual aids or even involving family members if the patient's comfortable with that. It's about going beyond just verbal communication and finding creative ways to connect.
Absolutely. And sometimes involving a trusted family member or friend can help bridge that communication gap. They might be able to explain things in a way that resonates with the patient or provide reassurance that can help reduce their anxiety.
Okay, so let's say I've done my best to assess the patient's capacity, and it seems like they truly lack the ability to make an informed decision about their medication at this time. What happens then? Do we just force them to take it against their will?
That's where things get even more ethically complex and where those legal frameworks we discussed earlier come into play. Remember the principle of acting in the person's best interests. If someone truly lacks capacity, our responsibility shifts to making decisions that we believe will promote their well being, even if they can't fully participate in that decision making process at that moment.
So it's like stepping into their shoes and advocating for them, even if they might be resisting our efforts to help.
Exactly. But it's crucial to remember the other principle, choosing the least restrictive option. Before resorting to measures like enforced medication, we need to exhaust all other avenues. Have we tried different communication techniques? Have we explored alternative treatments or therapies? Have we involved their support system in the decision making process?
It's a reminder that our actions shouldn't be driven by a desire to exert control, but rather a genuine commitment to upholding the person's dignity and autonomy, even within the confines of their illness.
Well said. And it's important to remember that these situations aren't always black and white. There's often a gray area where capacity might be fluctuating, where a patient might be partially capable of participating in decisions but still need support. That's where our clinical judgment and our ethical compass become paramount.
These scenarios are definitely making me think critically about the challenges ahead. It's one thing to learn about consent of capacity in a textbook, but it's another to apply it in a real clinical setting where emotions are running high and the stakes are so personal.
It is indeed a learning process and one that continues throughout your career. But the more you practice applying these principles, the more they will become ingrained in your approach to patient care. It's about developing a deep respect for each individual's unique circumstances, their strengths, their vulnerabilities, and their right to self-determination, even amidst the challenges of mental illness.
You mentioned earlier that capacity can fluctuate, and I can see how that would make things even trickier. Let's say we have a patient who's recovering from a severe depressive episode. They're
Mhm.
starting to feel better, but they're still quite vulnerable. How do we assess their capacity in that kind of situation? Are there any specific red flags that we should be looking out for?
That's a great example of the nuances we often encounter in mental health. Even as someone is recovering, their capacity might not be fully restored. So, some red flags to watch for might be if they're easily overwhelmed by information, if they have difficulty articulating their preferences, or if their decisions seem impulsive or inconsistent with their usual values.
So it's like we're walking a tightrope between supporting their autonomy and ensuring they're not making decisions based on a fleeting emotional state or vulnerability. It seems like finding that balance requires a lot of sensitivity and careful observation.
You've hit the nail on the head. And it often involves having those tough conversations, checking in with the patient regularly, and asking those open ended questions like, how are you feeling about making this decision right now? Do you feel pressured in any way? It's about creating a safe space where they feel comfortable expressing their doubts or concerns.
It's a reminder that effective communication is more than just conveying medical information. It's about building rapport, establishing trust, and really listening to the patient's perspective.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that even when someone is clinically improving their capacity might still be a bit wobbly, like that four-legged stool with one leg slightly shorter than the others. And our role is to provide that extra support, that steady hand until they regain their footing.
This is all so valuable for me as someone just starting out in mental health nursing. It's not just about learning the rules and procedures. It's about cultivating that ethical awareness and developing the skills to navigate these complex situations with compassion and integrity.
You've summed it up perfectly. It's a journey, and it's one that will continually challenge you to think critically, to question your assumptions, and to advocate for your patients with an unwavering commitment.
Speaking of challenges, let's shift our focus to another legal concept that you highlighted as being particularly relevant for mental health student nurses: advanced decisions to refuse treatment, or ADRTs. We touched upon them earlier, but I'm keen to explore how these documents might come into play in a mental health setting.
ADRTs can be particularly relevant in mental health because we often work with individuals who experience fluctuations in their mental state and capacity. So, an ADRT allows someone to make their wishes known during a period of stability, ensuring that those wishes are respected even if they later lose capacity to make decisions.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider conditions like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, where someone might experience periods of psychosis or severe depression. But how do ADRTs actually work in practice? Let's say a patient arrives at the hospital in a manic state, and they have an ADRT stating they refuse certain medications. What steps would a mental health nurse need to take?
That's a really good scenario to consider. So the first step is always to verify the validity of the ADRT. Is it signed and witnessed correctly? Does it clearly state the specific treatments they're refusing? And this is crucial, assess the patient's current capacity. Remember, an ADRT only comes into play when someone lacks capacity. If they currently have capacity, their current wishes override the ADRT, even if those wishes contradict what's stated in the document.
So it's like a two-step verification process. Verify the document, then verify the patient's current state of mind. That seems really important, especially in mental health, where a person's capacity can change so rapidly.
Exactly. You can't just blindly follow an ADRT without considering the context of the situation. What if the patient created the ADRT years ago and their views on treatment have since evolved? What if the medications listed in the ADRT are now considered outdated or inappropriate for their current condition? These are the kinds of nuances that require careful consideration and ethical decision making.
It sounds like working with ADRTs in mental health requires a lot of critical thinking and the ability to balance those legal requirements with the patient's evolving needs and wishes. Are there any common pitfalls that mental health student nurses should be aware of when it comes to ADRTs?
One common pitfall is assuming that an ADRT is a do not treat order. It's not. It's a specific refusal of certain treatments under certain conditions. Another pitfall is failing to recognize that capacity can fluctuate. Just because someone lacks capacity at one point in time doesn't mean they'll always lack capacity. It's essential to reassess regularly and be open to the possibility that the patient's wishes might change as their condition evolves.
These are all great points to keep in mind. It's a reminder that working with ADRTs in mental health is not just about following a set of rules. It's about understanding the spirit of the law, the nuances of capacity, and the importance of individualizing care to meet each patient's unique needs.
Absolutely. It's about respecting a person's autonomy and their right to make choices about their own body and treatment. Even when those choices might not align with our own perspectives or medical recommendations, it's about holding that tension between our duty of care and our respect for individual self-determination.
This conversation has really shed light on the complexities of consent and capacity in mental health care. But there's another legal framework that we haven't delved into yet, and it's one that often triggers strong emotions and ethical dilemmas. Significant restriction of liberty, or SROL.
Ah, yes, SROL. It's a topic that often sparks debate and raises fundamental questions about human rights autonomy and the role of mental health professionals in safeguarding vulnerable individuals.
I mean, the very term restriction of liberty sounds quite harsh. When does this come into play? And what are the ethical considerations that mental health student nurses need to be aware of?
So, SROL is a legal mechanism that allows for the restriction of someone's freedom of movement when they lack capacity to consent to the arrangements for their care and treatment, and when it's deemed necessary to protect them from harm or to ensure their well-being.
So it's a last resort measure, something that's only implemented after all other less restrictive options have been exhausted.
Precisely. It's not a decision that's made lightly. It's a complex process that involves careful assessment, multiple layers of oversight, and adherence to strict legal safeguards.
Okay, let's walk through a hypothetical scenario to help us understand how this might work in practice. Imagine you're working on a mental health ward, and you have a patient who's experiencing severe paranoia and delusions. They believe that the staff are trying to poison them, and they're becoming increasingly agitated and unpredictable. What would be the steps involved in considering an SROL in this kind of situation?
That's a scenario that could very well lead to an SROL being considered, as the patient's actions could be putting themselves or others at risk. So the first step would be to try all less restrictive options. Can we de-escalate the situation through verbal communication? Can we offer alternative medications or therapies? Can we involve their family or support system to provide reassurance?
So it's about exhausting all those possibilities before resorting to something as restrictive as an SROL. That makes me think about that principle of choosing the least restrictive option. It's not just a nice-sounding ideal, it's a fundamental part of ethical practice.
You're absolutely right. Restricting someone's liberty should always be a last resort, not a first response. It's a serious intervention with significant ethical and legal implications.
Okay, let's say we've tried everything and the situation isn't improving. The patient is still highly agitated and poses a risk to themselves or others. What happens next? Who makes the decision about whether to implement an SROL?
In most jurisdictions, the initial decision to implement an SROL often involves an urgent authorization process, kind of like an emergency measure to ensure immediate safety. This might be done by a senior clinician or a designated mental health professional. However, it's important to note that this initial authorization is usually time-limited, meaning it needs to be reviewed and potentially endorsed by a higher authority within a specific time frame.
So it's not like a doctor can just decide to lock someone up indefinitely. There are checks and balances in place to prevent that kind of abuse of power.
Exactly. The legal frameworks surrounding esrol are designed to protect the individual's rights and ensure that any restriction on their liberty is justified, proportionate, and subject to rigorous oversight. So in most cases, after that initial urgent authorization, a more thorough assessment is required to determine if the SRL should continue.
Okay, so who conducts that more thorough assessment? Is it the same clinician who made the initial authorization?
Typically, a more independent assessment is required. This might involve a capacity and liberty assessor, or a CLA, as we discussed earlier. So the CLA is an independent professional who's trained to evaluate a person's capacity and determine whether the proposed restrictions on their liberty are justified and proportionate.
So the CLA is like a neutral third party who comes in, gathers information, observes the patient, and makes a recommendation about whether the SROL is truly necessary and in the person's best interests.
That's a great way to put it. The CLA's role is crucial in ensuring that SROL decisions are made objectively and with the individual's rights at the forefront. They gather information from various sources, the person themselves, their family healthcare professionals, and they carefully observe the person's behavior to assess their understanding and their ability to make decisions about their care.
This whole process sounds incredibly complex and emotionally charged. I can imagine it being particularly difficult for family members who might be torn between wanting to protect their loved one and feeling uneasy about restricting their freedom.
You're absolutely right. These situations are fraught with ethical dilemmas and emotional complexities for everyone involved. It's important for mental health professionals to approach these situations with empathy, sensitivity, and a commitment to open communication.
Okay, let's say the CLA has completed their assessment and recommends that the SROL should continue. What happens next? Who makes the final decision?
In most jurisdictions, the CLA's recommendation is submitted to a higher authority, often a judicial body or a tribunal, who has the ultimate power to authorize or reject the SRL. So this final decision is typically based on the CLA's assessment, any other relevant medical or social evidence, and the views of the individual, their family, and their advocates.
So there are multiple layers of oversight built into the system to ensure that decisions about restricting someone's liberty are not made lightly and are subject to rigorous scrutiny.
Exactly. The goal is to strike that delicate balance between protecting a person's rights and ensuring their safety and well-being. It's a complex process that demands careful consideration, ethical awareness, and a commitment to upholding the dignity of all individuals involved.
Wow, this deep dive into SROL has really opened my eyes to the complexities of this legal framework and the ethical challenges that it presents. It's clear that as future mental health nurses, we need to be well-versed in these concepts and prepared to navigate these difficult situations with sensitivity and skill. But there's one question that keeps lingering in my mind. What happens if someone disagrees with the decision to implement or continue an SROL? Do they have any recourse? Can they challenge the decision?
That's an excellent question, and one that highlights the importance of due process and protecting individual rights, even in challenging circumstances. So in most jurisdictions, there are mechanisms in place for individuals subject to SROLs, as well as their families or advocates to challenge the decision. This might involve appealing to a higher authority, such as a tribunal or a court, to review the case and determine if the SROL is truly justified and in the person's best interests.
So even though these situations can be incredibly complex and emotionally charged, there are legal safeguards in place to ensure that everyone's voice is heard and that decisions are made fairly and transparently.
Exactly. It's about upholding the principles of justice and fairness, even in the most challenging of circumstances. And it's about recognizing that while mental health professionals have a duty of care, individuals retain their fundamental rights, even when their capacity to make decisions might be compromised.
This has been such an enlightening conversation, and I'm already feeling much more equipped to approach these complex situations with greater awareness and understanding. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd like to circle back to something we touched upon earlier, the concept of best interests. We've talked about how crucial it is to act in a person's best interests when they lack capacity to make decisions for themselves. But how do we actually determine what those best interests are, especially when dealing with the complexities of mental health?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one of the most challenging and nuanced aspects of working with individuals who lack capacity. There's no easy answer, no formula to follow. It requires a holistic approach, careful consideration of individual circumstances, and a willingness to grapple with ethical dilemmas.
This feels like the perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive, where we can really unpack the complexities of determining best interests and explore how these principles translate into real-world action. I'm eager to hear your insights and learn more about how I can develop those skills as a future mental health nurse.
Yeah, I'm happy to delve deeper into that with you. It's a topic that deserves careful consideration and thoughtful discussion.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been covering some pretty heavy stuff, haven't we? Consent capacity legal frameworks like ADRTs and SRALs, all incredibly relevant to your future as mental health student nurses. But now I think we're getting to what might be the trickiest part of it all, figuring out someone's best interests when they can't tell us themselves.
You're absolutely right. It is a weighty responsibility, and there's no easy answer. It's about understanding a person's values, wishes, hopes, even if they can't articulate them clearly in that moment.
It makes those initial definitions of consent we talked about even more crucial, doesn't it? Informed, voluntary. Those things become almost impossible if the person can't participate in the decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And it highlights why we need to be so diligent about assuming capacity whenever possible and really exhausting all those less restrictive options before we step in to make choices for someone.
The sources that we've looked at really emphasize that best interests aren't about what WE think is best as professionals, but what's best for that person themselves. But that must be so hard to figure out sometimes, especially in mental health.
It is. It's a process of gathering as much information as we can, like detectives piecing together clues, talking to family friends, caregivers, anyone who can shed light on the person's usual values, preferences, even their quirks.
It makes me think about that patient with dementia we discussed earlier, refusing their medication. You mentioned looking beyond the refusal itself and trying to understand the why behind it.
Right. Are they scared of side effects, confused about what the pills are for? Maybe they're trying to assert that little bit of control that they still feel like they have. Each why leads to a different approach.
Okay, so let's play that out. Let's say this patient with dementia is usually quite a social person, but the medication makes them drowsy. So they're missing out on activities they used to love. Could that be a factor in their best interests?
Absolutely. In that case, best interests might not be about forcing the medication just to control symptoms. It might be about finding a balance, perhaps a lower dose, different timing, or even exploring non-medication approaches to manage their condition, all while making sure that they can still participate in those social activities that bring them joy.
It's a reminder that best interests aren't static. They can evolve as the person's circumstances change, as their needs shift, as new information comes to light.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of observation, assessment, and reassessment. We're constantly asking ourselves, what's changed? What new information do we have? Are our actions still aligned with what we believe is in this person's best interests at this moment?
It's a lot of responsibility. And I imagine there's a lot of gray area. What are some strategies that you found helpful in navigating those murky waters of best interests,
Hmm.
especially when there's no clear-cut answer?
Hmm. One thing that's always helped me is to frame it as a collaborative process. It's not just about the healthcare team making pronouncements. It's about engaging with the person to the extent they're able to, their family, and other professionals involved in their care.
So like a roundtable discussion where everyone brings their unique perspective and knowledge to the table.
Precisely. The family might share insights into the person's past wishes or values, which can be incredibly valuable. A social worker might bring a different lens focusing on the person's social and environmental needs. And of course, the person themselves, even if their capacity is limited, might still be able to express preferences or discomfort, in subtle ways.
That collaborative approach feels much more respectful than a top-down decision-making model. It acknowledges that everyone has something valuable to contribute to this complex equation of best interests.
Yeah, and it also helps to document everything meticulously. Not just the medical facts, but those subjective observations. How did the person react to certain suggestions? Were there any nonverbal cues that might indicate their preferences? This creates a trail of reasoning that can be revisited and reevaluated as the simulation evolves.
It makes me think about those legal frameworks we discussed earlier,
Yeah.
like ADRTs and SRALs. It seems like meticulous documentation would be crucial in those situations, not only for ethical reasons, but also to ensure that decisions are being made transparently and with appropriate justification.
You're spot on. In cases involving those legal frameworks, documentation becomes even more crucial. It provides evidence that we've carefully considered all options, consulted with relevant parties, and arrived at our decisions through a thoughtful and ethical process.
This whole discussion about best interests has really highlighted the human element at the heart of mental health care. It's not just about treating symptoms, it's about honoring the person behind the illness, their individuality, and their right to be treated with dignity and respect.
That's beautifully put. And it's a reminder that even when someone lacks capacity, they're still whole individuals with a rich inner life, a history, a network of relationships that shape who they are. And our role is to hold that complexity in mind as we strive to make decisions that truly reflect their best interests.
It's a humbling and challenging responsibility, but one that I feel more prepared to embrace after this deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with us today. It's been incredibly valuable.
My pleasure. I hope this conversation has equipped you with a deeper understanding of consent capacity and the intricate dance of ethical decision making in mental health care.
And all you mental health student nurses out there, remember, this is just the beginning of your journey. These concepts will stay with you throughout your careers, challenging you to think critically, act compassionately, and advocate fiercely for your patients. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, that's normal. This is complex stuff. So dive into those show notes, revisit the sources, and keep those conversations going. And as always, keep diving deep into the knowledge that will make you the best nurses you can be.